All right. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Tuesday. How's it going? Everybody all right? So? What's up? What's up, Abby? What's
Nothing.
what's wrong?
Nothing.
Nothing's wrong?
No.
Are you sure? You looked a little like,
No.
no? Everything's all right? Regina, everything okay? So? Okay. Anna, you all right? Okay. Okay. So, Alicia's here too. Good morning, Alicia. Let's jump in. So today we're gonna, yes, sir.
Sir, so we don't have a final exam, final project.
Yes, correct. No final exam, final project.
And we'll present.
Last week of class, maybe the Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So that's April 12, 13, 14 maybe, or 11, 12, 13. Something like that. Yeah, we'll do it then. So we've got a little bit of time left. I'll give you some more class time. Maybe what's today? Maybe tomorrow I can give you some class time to work if you want. Would that be okay? Would that be good? Okay. A very quick nod from Regina. Okay. I'll give you some time to work tomorrow. Okay. For today, I wanted to press pause on the Cold War and talk a little bit about the story of China. Okay. And if you know anything about Chinese history, China's a remarkable country. It has an incredibly long history, and shockingly, it's got a long kind of imperial history. It's got a series of dynasties or families of emperors that stretch back 3,000 or 4,000 years. And shockingly, those emperors and those dynasties occur all the way into the 20th century. So the last Chinese emperor is around, I think in 1911 is when he is either overthrown or he steps down, which is unbelievable, right? That's almost like saying there was a pharaoh in Egypt until 1911. Unbelievable. But China has, as I say, a long kind of dynastic history until 11, when the emperor steps down and the party is kind of, or the country is declared the people's, no, it's just declared the Republic of China. And so the initial kind of stages of Chinese history in the early 20th century is kind of, in a way, it's almost like Russia in that there's kind of, it looks like a democracy might kind of evolve and form, but instead they wind up with someone who's closer to a military dictator instead. But we'll get to that. So, to start off with, sadly, I have some reading for you to do, but I do have kind of an interesting documentary to show you in a day or so. So, we'll get to see some video and some images out of China a little bit later, but I just want to lay the groundwork for us here. And so, this section of the text will talk about what I was just referring to, the sort of how China kind of starts out the 20th century. Again, we'll ignore the thousands of years that come before, and we'll just look at the stepping down of the emperor and the kind of first version of kind of non-imperial government in China and what that looks like, okay? So I'm just going to, that's actually a lot to read, but that's okay. Is it a lot? I'll give you a break halfway through so it's not so intense. But I'm just going to put it into Microsoft Teams, and then, no, skip the case studies, please. Where is it now? There it is. There it is. So that section of the textbook is in Microsoft Teams if you're online or if you're using it. Maybe what I'll do is I'll put, just to break it up so it's not so bad, I'll put 10 minutes on the clock and I'll check in with you in 10 minutes and see where we are, and then maybe we can talk about some of these things, okay? Pardon me. Morning, Ryan. Just a couple more minutes, if that's okay. Just one more minute. One more minute. Okay, so as you can see, sorry, I got a little frog in my throat today. That's probably not an expression. Have you heard of that expression before? That you have a frog in your throat? When you sound a little bit croaky, like ribbit. Anyway. As you can see here, China at the beginning of the 20th century is very much, it's kind of like Russia at the beginning of the 20th century, right? It's a big country, like there's a lot of people, but it's also relatively poor, right? Most people are kind of simple peasant farmers. They don't really own any of their land. They don't really have any money or anything. China doesn't really have any industrial capacity to speak of. All they really have is they have a single leader, not a czar, but an emperor, and some nobles at the top of society that own all the land and have all the money. And then everyone else is just kind of a poor farmer, right? And we know, of course, that Russia, the czar steps down. There's a moment where they might have a democratic government until Lenin and his Bolsheviks charge in, seize control, and create a communist state. And so here in China, we're looking at kind of a similar starting point in some ways, right? The emperor steps down or is overthrown, and then we have this kind of political party that manages to take control. And what's their name? What's their name? Avi, what's their name? Give it a shot. Okay, I think it's pronounced Guomindang. My Mandarin is very rusty, in that I don't speak any Mandarin at all, but I think it's pronounced Guomindang. Guomindang are a political party. As you see here, one of their founders is it Sun Yizhan or Sun Yat-sen? We keep getting two versions of the names of these people. Why is there two versions? We have Jiang Jieshi, and then in brackets it says Chiang Kai-shek. Why do we have two? What? Nickname? No, not quite. There's two languages, prominent languages in China, right? Mandarin and Cantonese. So they're always giving us both, right? The Mandarin version first, and then the Cantonese version in brackets, right? So Jiang Jieshi is the Mandarin version of this person's name. Chiang Kai-shek is the Cantonese version, I think, right? right? I think so. So, we have this Kuomintang party, right? They're a nationalist Chinese party. They take control, they declare themselves, or they declare the country the Republic of China. The party is kind of a mix of different people, right? There's some people who are pro-democracy. There's a few communists mixed in there as well. It looks like maybe China might have some sort of democratic government, but after the death of Sun Yat-sen, or shoot, I keep forgetting his Mandarin name. It's Sun Yizhan, yeah. So after Sun Yizhan's death, the party kind of starts to drift into a military dictatorship, right? It's under the control of Jiang Jieshi, who is a general, and he kind of allies himself with the rich landowners and starts basically running the country as a dictator, right? He's going off on military campaigns trying to sort of unite China, because China was kind of a little bit decentralized after the emperor abdicated. And so he's trying to pull China together and get it under the control of his party. And in the process, again, he becomes kind of a military dictator. So it's similar to Russia. It seems like there's almost a chance where China might have become a democratic country, but then it kind of loses that chance as Jiang Jieshi takes over, right? Now, this is an interesting question. How would you answer number 9? Did you have any thoughts on that? This is a strange question. And to be honest, I'm not really sure how to answer it either. Well, how about this? We know that the Kuomintang take power in China under Jiang Jieshi. We know that the party is, yes, miss? What? The questions are on 113, sorry. Questions are on 113. So, the Kuomintang are kind of a mix of people, but then something's going to happen to the communists that are part of this party. What happens to them? Because this is an important thing. What happens to the communists? Yeah, and why was that, do you think? Right. So it seems that what happened is that the kind of wealthy business owners and landowners, they wanted the communists gone, right? Because of course, they probably saw what happened in Russia, right? The communists came to power. Suddenly everything belonged to the state. There was no private property anymore. And if you were a wealthy business owner or landowner before, all of a sudden you had nothing, right? So this is another answer to the question, why was the Russian Revolution significant? Well, because the Chinese, or the wealthy business owners that were part of Kuomintang, saw what was happening in Russia and said, oh, we don't want that here, because we're going to lose all of our stuff, right? We're going to lose our business and our riches and all kinds of things. And so he pressures Jiang Jieshi, the head of Kuomintang, he pressures him to get rid of the communists, right? Which they do. They execute a bunch of them, and a bunch of them flee the party and run off into the countryside, right? And of course, One of them is a man named Mao Zedong, right? And he's going to he's going to become very, very important, right? He's going to, like Stalin, he's basically going to create communist China, right? So he's not. I wouldn't compare him to Stalin directly. I don't feel like he's not the same kind of person, but he is kind of the architect of communist China, at least in the 20th century anyway. So he's one of these communists that are going to flee the Kuomintang into the countryside and start to kind of build support there, right? Which of course he finds, right? Because the people in the countryside are poor, they're peasant farmers, and communism sounds good, right? It's the same kind of promise that Lenin made to the Russians, right? Peace, land, bread, right? You will have the land will belong to you. You will have everything you need, right? He makes those kind of promises just like Lenin does. And again, if you're a poor farmer with no land, those promises sound really encouraging, right? And so Mao starts to kind of build a following in the countryside. And so you can see a bit of a split happening here, right? The richer urban business owners and landowners, right, of the Kuomintang, and then the communists who are in the countryside, right, with the poor agricultural peasants, right? So there's kind of two sides to this, and as you can see, before long, we start to get a civil war going on between the two of them, right? Pardon me. Mao has managed to get enough support to try to take control, and Jiang Jieshi is going to try to eradicate this communist threat, right? Of course, complicating all of these efforts is the Japanese, right? Because the Japanese are trying to take control of parts of China for their own ends, right? We know that they're trying to industrialize, and so they're trying to take over parts of Manchuria, and so Jiang Jiexi's got to deal with the Japanese, and he's also got to deal with the communists who are trying to kind of take control as well, right? So, let me see, pulling down. So, what happens in Manchuria? What happens in Manchuria? Let's say what happens in Manchuria in around 1937, because maybe that's a little more specific. Yeah, so they already kind of had a presence in Manchuria, but they sort of pushed to take over that entire area, right? And as you can see, or as you read, it kind of started in almost an accidental way, right? Somebody got nervous, somebody started shooting, they started shooting back at each other, and before you knew it, it blew up into a whole thing, right? And so, again, you've got to be careful when tensions are high, right? Because war can break out very quickly. But here we see, yeah, that the Japanese invade, they push, they're able to push Jiang Jieshi and his Kuomintang out of some of the major cities. He takes refuge kind of further up in northeastern China. We see that the Japanese engage in a bunch of brutality toward Chinese cities, particularly Nanjing, right? in an attempt to get Jiang Jieshi to bargain, right, to negotiate. He doesn't, and so the Japanese are kind of left to Manchuria, right? And I feel like Jiang Jieshi is kind of waiting to be rescued, right? He's kind of waiting to be rescued by one of his larger allies. But unfortunately, war has broken out by this time, right? World War II is happening, and so the civil war between the Kuomintang and the communists is kind of on hold, right? Meanwhile, Jiang Jieshi is kind of hoping that one of his major allies will fight the Japanese and defeat them, which is fair because he's correct, right? The Americans will defeat the Japanese, and so that civil war is kind of in a timeout, and Jiang Jieshi kind of sits back and just waits for somebody to take Japan out of the fight. And again, he's pardon me, he's correct in thinking that because the Americans will do just that, right? The Americans will defeat the Japanese in 1945. The Japanese will surrender, and basically as soon as they do, Jiang Jieshi will resume his fight with the communists, right? So the Civil War will kind of be on pause while the Second World War is going on. Jiang Jieshi will kind of just sit tight, and then once Japan is defeated by the United States, the timeout is off, and he's back fighting the communists, okay? So, as you can see here, things kind of go maybe not so well for China following the abdication of the emperor, right? There's a chance for democracy, but it kind of dies. The whole area falls under a military dictatorship, and then it falls into civil war, right? As the nationalist Kuomintang is fighting against the communists. During World War II, everything gets put on pause, although the Japanese attack and brutalize China before that. And then once World War II is over and the Japanese are defeated, civil war is on again, right? Spoiler alert, we kind of know the communists are going to win, but until that time, war is on. Okay, do you want to take a little break? Yeah, okay, let's take a break. We'll come back and we'll deal with a little more China. Okay. Okay, welcome back. So, we've set the stage here in China with kind of two parties. We know that the first party comes out of the kind of fall of the Manchu Emperor in about 1911. This Kuomintang party starts out, and it's a nationalist party, right? So it's kind of pro-China, as one would hope, since it's governing China. It's a pro-China nationalist party, but it's got different people in it, right? Some people are interested in democracy. Some people are interested in communism. I'm not sure that Jiang Jieshi is interested in either of them, but he winds up being the leader of the party, and he slowly kind of falls into a military dictatorship way of governing, right? He kind of, when he talks to the Americans and his other allies, he talks about democracy, but really, that's not what China has, right? He goes about trying to unite all of China under his rule, which he's reasonably successful at. But then the wealthy landowners, convinced Jiang Jieshi to expel communists from the party, right? And so Mao is one of those. The communists flee to the countryside and start to build support amongst the poor peasants. So we've got the Kuomintang here in one corner, the communists in the other. And again, we said that this guy is going to be important, of course. He's going to be kind of the architect of communist China, and will kind of steer it from the birth of communist China in 1949, really up until the 1970s. He won't be in sole power that whole time, but even after he's kind of pushed aside a little bit, we'll see that he still remains a really important cultural figure and one with a lot of influence. And we'll see that in the Cultural Revolution, Mao is able to just, even though he doesn't have any legal authority, he just tells people to do things and they do it. He doesn't even have to force them to do it. So Mao's got a lot of prestige, right? He's got a lot of kind of social power, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So we have the Kuomintang versus Mao's communists in the countryside. A civil war breaks out. I'm not going to get you to read that, don't worry. We said that Jiang Jieshi was able to kind of consolidate his control of China, but of course he had to deal with the Japanese, right, who were trying to access raw materials for their industrialization. And so Jiang Jieshi's kind of got two things going on. He's trying to keep the communists from bothering him, but he's also trying to repel the Japanese, right? Of course, in the context of all of this, World War II breaks out. We see that Jiang Jieshi kind of steps back and hopes that the Allies will defeat Japan in the course of World War II. That's a good bet because they do, in fact, defeat Japan. And then Jiang Jieshi can return to the stage and start to fight against the communists. But of course, we'll see, and I'll just jump ahead here, we'll see that ultimately the communists will succeed, right? Mao's communists will push Jiang Jieshi's Kuomintang out, and the Kuomintang will flee to what's called Formosa at the time, or Taiwan. And so they'll kind of hide out there. They'll be supported by the Allies. There'll be sort of fantasies of getting the Kuomintang to return to China and try to take over, but that never really occurs, right? So the Kuomintang kind of sit it out on the sidelines in Taiwan, and it's Mao who will proclaim the People's Republic of China and start to build his communist paradise in China itself, okay? So I know I jumped through a lot, but that's okay. And that kind of brings us to here, to the Chinese Communist Party. And it's worth looking a little bit in depth at how the Chinese Communist Party came to be and how it works, because of course it is still in power at this very minute, right? The Chinese Communist Party is the one who runs China itself. China in the last, gosh, 20 years or so, has become a major economic and military and political power. And so they're very worth paying attention to at this point, just like Russia is. So I have this documentary to show you here, if you would like to see it. Would you like to see it? Oh, you would? Okay. I have this documentary here which talks a little bit about who and what the Chinese Communist Party is. And so if you'll just give me a second, pardon me, I'm just going to put this into Microsoft Teams for our people at home. And as you can see, I've got a few questions for us to pay attention to, okay? So, first question, of course, is what's Mao's policy toward ethnic minorities? What's a policy, by the way? How would you define a policy? A rule? Would you say a rule? Kind of, yeah, kind of. What else could we add to that definition? Policy is a rule or a... Regina's going to Google it. Okay, Google it and tell me what it says. Okay. Right. So it's kind of a proposed course of action, right? It's the approach, right? What's our policy on this? What's our approach? How do we think about it? How do we treat it? How do we deal with it, right? That's policy, right? You'll hear sometimes we talk about a nation's foreign policy. Foreign policy is how do we deal with the outside world, right? Who's our friends? Who's not our friends? How do we treat our friends? How do we treat people who are not our friends, right? This is foreign policy, right? So Mao, pardon me, will have a policy towards people who are not ethnic Chinese, but living in Chinese territory. What happens to farmers? That says are, but it should say as. I apologize, that's a typo. What happens to farmers as part of collectivization? So just like Lenin tried to do and Stalin brutally did, Mao's going to do the same thing, right? He's going to collectivize the farms of peasants. What does that mean, to collectivize? If I'm going to collectivize farms, what am I doing? Yeah, in part. I'm kind of taking over, but what else am I doing? Anna, what am I doing? Yeah, I'm sticking them all together, right? Here's 100 little peasant farms. Now they're all one farm, right? There's not 100 farms, there's just one, right? So Mao is going to do that as well. He's going to collectivize agriculture, just like Lenin and Stalin did before him, right? We'll see this 4 Pests campaign that Mao will suggest, and we'll see the effects of that. We'll hear a little bit about the Great Leap Forward, right? Now, this is something that Stalin basically did, right? With his 5-year plans, he needed to take the Soviet Union, which was mostly a poor agricultural country, and turn it into an industrial power, right? So he had 5-year plans that allowed him to jump forward, to leap forward, and become an industrial power. And as we read about, it worked, right? Stalin made it happen somehow. Mao will try to do the same thing with his Great Leap Forward, but we'll see how it goes. We'll see here the combined effects of these 2 things, the 4 Pests and the Great Leap Forward. And then we'll talk a little bit about the Cultural Revolution at the end, okay? Cultural Revolution comes a little bit later in Chinese history, but it's a big, significant event, okay? So, are we okay with that? Are we good to watch? Okay. So, for online people here, I'm going to suggest we watch 20 minutes. And then we'll answer the questions that we can in those 20 minutes, okay? So, if you're online, the questions and the link are in Microsoft Teams as well, or if you want to use them here. But let's jump in and see what we see. Let's see what we see of Zheng Jixi. No. All right, so that's a little intense, as you can see. Very quickly, before I let you go, because we've only got 5 minutes, what was Mao's policy towards ethnic minorities? Regina, what was it? Or anybody? Ethnic minorities are non-Chinese people living within China, of which there are, of course. Most people are ethnically Chinese, but not everybody. What was his policy there? Yeah. Yeah, that was supposed to be the plan, right? Is self-determination, just kind of let these people practice their culture and speak their language and make decisions for themselves, and they were just to kind of be left alone, right? We saw some of the collectivization efforts that happen, and again, it's very similar to what happens in the Soviet Union, right? The farms are collectivized, people are now working in teams, and the landowners are liquidated, they're removed, right? And here we see in China, they're kind of publicly shamed, sometimes they're sent away, sometimes they're killed, but those people don't really fit into the communist or socialist system, right? And so they are kind of removed from society in one way or another, right? Last thing, what happens in that Four Pests campaign? What's the problem that Mao is trying to solve? Well, that's the effect, but what is he trying to do? To what? No? What's he trying to do? Yeah. Yeah, so he's trying to get rid of these animals that kind of eat stored grain, right? Things like rats and birds and snakes and things like that. But what does he wind up doing? Well, they kill all the birds, and then insect numbers go through the roof, right? And then the insects eat all their crops. And so it's a disaster, right? It's a complete disaster. But as you can see, the Chinese people are behind Mao, right? It's a little different than Stalin, right? Because Stalin has to hammer communism into the people, right? The people don't want it, and Stalin uses the hammer and makes sure people do it. But here with Mao, it's a little bit different, because you can see the people are actually behind Mao, right? They're cheering him on. They like him. And so when Mao says, we're going to go out here and the Four Pests campaign, we're going to save our crops, people rush out to the countryside and they do it, right? They're right behind Mao, trying to do what he wants them to do, right? Of course, the results are disastrous. Tomorrow, we'll come back to this. We'll deal with the Great Leap Forward, which is similarly disastrous, and we'll deal with the Cultural Revolution, which is also disastrous. I think you're probably sensing a bit of a pattern here, but we'll deal with that tomorrow, okay? Also, tomorrow I'll give you some time to work on your presentation project, but we'll do those two things, okay? So that is all. Have a nice afternoon. I hope everything is well, and we'll see you tomorrow, okay?